It started on a quiet morning, the kind that smelled like cut grass and coffee, when Michael Turner stood at his kitchen window with his mug in hand, watching the mist rise from his lawn. It should have been peaceful, but that peace was broken, as it often was, by the sharp click of high heels and the sound of paws scuffing against his flower bed. There she was again, Karen Dillard, his next-door neighbor, marching straight across his yard like it was a public sidewalk. Her little white dog yanked at the leash, tearing through the line of tulips Michael had planted last month. And she didn't even flinch. She looked proud, her chin high, her sunglasses glinting in the morning light, the kind of woman who believed every space she stepped in should yield to her. She waved at him with that familiar smirk that made his blood simmer. "Good morning, Michael," she called, as if walking through another man's yard was an act of politeness instead of arrogance. He forced a smile, but his jaw tightened. This wasn't new. It had been happening for months, and every time, Karen acted like it was his fault for noticing. He told her nicely at first, gently reminding her that his property wasn't a shortcut. She laughed, saying, "The HOA allows shared access paths through corner lots." Michael had checked the rules, there was no such thing. She was bluffing, but the board was full of her friends, and he knew complaining to them was like whispering into the wind. He tried ignoring her for weeks, hoping she'd get tired of her little act, but she only grew bolder. Sometimes, she'd stop in the middle of his lawn to answer her phone, spinning slowly as her dog barked at butterflies. Once, he caught her trimming one of his rose bushes, and when he stepped outside, she just shrugged and said, they were sticking out. It wasn't just trespassing anymore. It was personal. Michael wasn't a man who liked confrontation. He'd moved to the neighborhood for peace after retiring from 30 years of engineering work. He liked his routines, coffee at sunrise, tending the garden, fixing things that didn't even need fixing. But every time Karen's heels clicked across his grass, every time she smiled that fake, sugary smile, something inside him cracked a little more. He could almost hear it, like the quiet snap of a branch under too much weight. That morning, something in her tone pushed him past quiet tolerance. She didn't just cross. She strutted, dragging her dog's leash behind her like a queen's ribbon, pretending not to notice the muddy tracks left on his freshly mowed lawn. Michael watched her until she disappeared behind the hedge, then slowly set his mug down. He could feel his heart pounding, not from anger alone, but from resolve. Enough was enough. He looked down at his grass, at the marks of her heels and her dog's paws, at the flowers she'd crushed underfoot, and he whispered to himself, no more. He had warned her, he had asked nicely, and she'd taken that as weakness. But now he was done asking. Later that day, Michael took out the property file from his office drawer. It was old, with coffee stains and yellowed paper, but it held the truth, his truth. The original survey map clearly marked his property line, extending several feet beyond where the HOA's new fence sat. He smiled faintly. Karen had no right to step even an inch across that line. But proving it wouldn't be enough. He knew people like her didn't care about rules, they cared about embarrassment, about image, about control. That's how she ruled the neighborhood. She was the kind of HOA queen who smiled at every barbecue while collecting gossip like ammunition. People feared her, avoided conflict with her, and in that silence, she thrived. Michael, however, wasn't part of her little court. That evening, he stepped outside with a tape measure, pacing the edges of his yard under the orange glow of sunset. The neighbors peered through curtains, whispering. They probably thought he was planning to build something, maybe another garden bed. He ignored them. He was calculating. Every inch mattered now. The air was warm, the sound of cicadas steady, and as the light faded, he felt an odd calm wash over him. A quiet before the storm he was about to summon. When he finally rolled up the tape, he smiled to himself. He had the space, the tools, and more patience than anyone realized. Karen might have turned his yard into her shortcut, but soon, that path would be hers to regret. The next morning, Michael caught her again, same time, same smirk. This time, he didn't look away. He opened his front door and stepped outside. Karen, he called. She paused, startled for a moment but quickly recovered, plastering on her neighborly smile. "Oh, good morning. Lovely day, isn't it?" she said, pretending not to see the annoyance in his eyes. "Karen, you're walking through my yard again," he said calmly, his voice steady but cold. "It's not a public path." She gave a small laugh. "Michael, don't be so dramatic. It's just a few steps of grass. I've been doing this for years. No one else has a problem." He folded his arms. "That's because no one else owns this property." She tilted her head, amused. "Well, if you don't want people walking through, maybe put up a fence." Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking defiantly against his soil. Michael stood there, watching her vanish again, the sound of her dog's bark echoing like mockery. Her words stuck with him, maybe put up a fence. He didn't want to trap himself in with wood and wire, but he could build something better, something that didn't block his view, just hers. That night, while the neighborhood slept, he stood at his back door, watching the shadows of trees stretch over the grass. He pictured where she usually stepped, how her path cut clean through the center, and an idea began to form, not out of anger anymore, but precision. He didn't want revenge, he wanted peace. But sometimes peace had to be engineered. He started researching late into the night. Motion sensors, pressure plates, small landscape speakers, all things he could install without anyone noticing. His old engineer's mind buzzed with excitement. It wasn't illegal, just creative. A harmless way to make a point. Over the next few days, he ordered supplies quietly. Packages arrived at his doorstep, boxes labeled garden accessories, lighting, sprinkler system. The mailman joked about his sudden hobby, and Michael just smiled. If only they knew. Meanwhile, Karen kept at it, acting like nothing was wrong. She'd walk her dog right past him, throw fake compliments about his yard, and once even said, "You're doing such a great job keeping the place tidy. I love walking through here. It feels so fresh." That was the day Michael nearly laughed out loud. She didn't realize every step she took was now being carefully mapped in his head. He knew exactly how her feet moved, where her dog stopped, which path she favored most. She'd been predictable, and predictability was his advantage. One afternoon, while Karen was out shopping, Michael began his quiet work. He dug shallow trenches just a few inches deep, careful not to disturb the grass too much. He ran thin sensor wires under the soil, connecting them to small garden lights and a few hidden speakers disguised as decorative rocks. He spent hours testing the system, fine-tuning it so the lights would flash red and a pre-recorded voice would play whenever someone walked across the yard. It wasn't dangerous, just startling. Enough to make anyone think twice before stepping again. When he finally finished, he stood in the middle of the lawn, sweating under the afternoon sun, looking at the perfectly normal grass around him. No one could tell anything had changed. To everyone else, it was still just a yard. But to him, it was a quiet line drawn in the sand, or rather under it. The next morning, he watched from his window again. Karen came as usual, coffee in one hand, leash in the other, humming to herself. Michael held his breath. As soon as she reached the center of the lawn, a sharp beep echoed, followed by the garden lights flickering bright red. The hidden speakers came alive with a calm mechanical voice. "Warning, private property. Step away." Karen froze. Her coffee cup trembled, spilling down her wrist. Her dog barked wildly. The voice repeated, "Warning, trespassing detected." She screamed, stumbling back, nearly dropping her purse. Then she ran, dragging the barking dog behind her, tripping over the curb in her panic. Michael leaned back against the wall, biting his lip to stop from laughing. He didn't move, didn't step outside, didn't gloat. He just smiled quietly to himself, sipping his coffee. By noon, the entire street knew. Karen had gone door to door complaining that Michael had turned his yard into a war zone. Some believed her, others didn't. The HOA president called him that evening, demanding he remove the system. Michael politely invited them to review the neighborhood bylaws. "There's no rule against decorative lighting or voice deterrence," he said simply. "I even checked with the county. It's all compliant." There was silence on the other end. Finally, the president muttered, "We'll look into it." They never called back. Karen didn't cross his yard for a week. But on the 8th day, pride got the better of her. She tried again, this time with her phone out, recording. She must have thought she could catch him breaking some law. The moment she stepped on the grass, the same lights burst to life. Warning: private property. She screamed again. But this time, her video caught her flailing backward into her own dog. The clip made it onto the neighborhood chat group within hours. By evening, everyone was laughing. Someone even made a meme out of it. That night, Michael sat on his porch, the sound of crickets filling the air. For the first time in months, he felt completely at ease. His yard was quiet again, untouched, peaceful. He looked at the dark sky above and whispered, "Now that's what I call property protection." From that day on, no one crossed his grass again. Not Karen, not her dog, not even the mailman without calling first. The shortcut was officially closed, and peace returned to Michael's little corner of the world, built not by anger, but by clever hands and quiet patience. Michael sat quietly at the back of the HOA meeting hall, his fingers tapping lightly against the folder in his lap, the one that held every photo, timestamp, and printed email he had collected over the last few weeks. The room smelled faintly of cheap coffee and carpet cleaner, filled with the sound of neighbors chatting about flowers, fences, and lawn heights like these were matters of national importance. Karen sat near the front, of course, her posture perfect, her laughter sharp, the queen of the room surrounded by her loyal little circle of admirers. She glanced back once, just long enough to flash that smirk he had come to know too well, the one that said she thought she had already won whatever this was. Michael didn't react, he just adjusted his papers and waited. The meeting dragged through boring reports until the agenda reached community concerns. When his name was called, he stood up slowly, his calm voice carrying across the chatter, and said, "I'd like to address repeated trespassing on my property." The room went silent for a moment before the murmuring began. He handed over a printed photo, Karen's heels sinking into his lawn, her dog yanking at the flowers, clear as day. He spoke politely, carefully explaining that this had been happening for months, that signs hadn't helped, and that it was damaging his garden. For a brief second, there was quiet understanding in a few faces. But then Denise, the HOA vice president and Karen's closest friend, leaned forward with a forced laugh. "Michael," she said, voice dripping with condescension, "we're talking about a little shortcut across the grass, not a crime scene." A few people chuckled, and Karen smirked like a cat that had cornered a mouse. Michael didn't flinch. He simply replied, "It's still my property, Denise, and it's been disrespected repeatedly." Denise shrugged, flipping through some papers like she had better things to do. "Honestly, this seems petty. We're a community here. We share, we help, we coexist. You're not suggesting we start putting up walls, are you?" Karen leaned back in her chair, pretending to look bored, but her eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. "He's just being dramatic," she added loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It's a few steps of grass. Maybe he should try being neighborly instead of territorial." The room laughed again, small chuckles rippling through the crowd. Michael stood there, patient as a stone, while inside something heavy settled behind his ribs. He had hoped logic and evidence would matter, that people would see what was right, but all he saw were fake smiles hiding cowardice. No one dared go against Karen. Not because she was right, but because she was loud. He thanked the board, turned, and left the meeting without another word. The laughter faded behind him as the door closed, replaced by the soft night air and the chirping of crickets. He walked slowly down the dim street toward his house, the glow of porch lights flickering like quiet witnesses. He didn't feel anger as much as something colder, something clearer. A calm determination that filled the spaces where frustration had once lived. When he reached his gate, he stopped and looked across the lawn. The grass shimmered under the moonlight, a calm ocean of green that had been stepped on too many times. He could still see faint marks from her heels that morning, pressed into the soil like reminders. He sighed, whispering to himself, "They laughed because they think I'm finished. They'll stop laughing soon." He went inside, The house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall. It was the kind of silence that made thoughts louder. He poured himself a glass of water, sat by the window, and stared at the yard again. His mind replayed every word from the meeting. Every dismissive smile, every fake laugh, every time they made him sound unreasonable for wanting respect. That was when the shift happened. He wasn't going to argue with them anymore. Words were useless against people who refused to listen. He had spent his whole life solving problems through design, through structure, through clever thinking, not noise. He had built bridges, repaired engines, and created systems that never failed. He knew that sometimes the best way to teach a lesson wasn't by shouting, but by letting people experience consequences. The next morning, Karen waved at him again from across the fence, her voice sweet as poison. "Morning, Michael. No hard feelings about last night, right?" She smiled, wide and fake, her dog tugging at the leash. He looked at her calmly and said, "Of course not, Karen. I learned a lot." Her eyes flickered, unsure if that was sarcasm or surrender. She shrugged and walked off, cutting straight through his grass like nothing had changed. Her dog left paw prints behind, and she didn't even glance down. Michael turned away, smiling faintly. He had learned something, indeed not about her, but about what kind of people they were dealing with. The HOA didn't care about fairness. They cared about comfort. As long as no one disturbed their sense of superiority, they'd pretend everything was fine. That day, Michael went to the hardware store. He didn't tell anyone what he was buying. Just small things, wiring, timers, solar lights, and something that looked like parts for an irrigation system. The cashier joked, "Looks like you're building a little fortress there." "Huh?" Michael just smiled and said, "Something like that." On his way home, he drove past Karen's house. She was in her driveway, chatting loudly with another neighbor, probably retelling her version of last night's meeting. He could almost hear her voice in his head, mocking him, twisting his words. He didn't slow down, didn't glare. He just kept driving because he knew that soon her story wouldn't matter. When he got home, he went straight to his workshop in the garage. The tools gleamed under the light, everything neatly organized. The one space in his world where order still existed. He spread out the materials, sketched a small layout of his yard, and began to work. His hands moved with precision and quiet focus. Every wire he stripped, every connection he tested, felt like therapy. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. A way to take back what was his without breaking a single law. While others wasted time on gossip, he built. That was who he was. That was how he won. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the neighborhood lights flickered on. The world outside buzzed with weekend noise. Children playing, car doors slamming, someone's TV echoing faintly. But Michael's yard was silent. He stood there for a long time, feeling the breeze move through the grass, brushing against his legs like a whisper. Somewhere in that quiet, he made himself a promise. Not just to protect his property, but to reclaim the respect they had all tried to take from him. The HOA could laugh, Karen could mock, but they had no idea what he was capable of when pushed too far. He wasn't going to fight them in meetings or letters anymore. He was going to remind them that some people don't raise their voices, they raise the stakes. That night, as he closed his curtains, he caught sight of movement outside. Karen again, sneaking across his yard even in the dark, her dog darting ahead under the pale glow of the streetlight. She must have thought she was clever, crossing when she thought he couldn't see. He watched her, not with anger but curiosity, like an engineer observing the last piece of data before a test. The pattern was complete now. He knew her timing, her route, her carelessness. He smiled to himself, turned off the lights, and went to bed with a calm heart. The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed again with gossip about the HOA meeting, and Michael heard snippets as he mowed the front lawn. Some said he had embarrassed himself. Others said he was right but too serious. It didn't matter. He waved at people who avoided eye contact, and when Karen passed by again, this time using the sidewalk, he almost laughed. Maybe she was just giving it a rest, or maybe she could sense the change in the air. Either way, the next phase was coming, and Michael Turner was ready. He wasn't the quiet retiree they thought he was anymore. He was the man who would teach an entire street the difference between ownership and entitlement. One carefully engineered surprise at a time, Michael woke before dawn, the kind of still hour where even the wind seemed hesitant to move, and sat by the window staring at the lawn that had once been his pride and joy but had become a constant reminder of humiliation. A stage where Karen performed her arrogance daily, trampling over his peace as if his home were a shortcut in her story. The grass glistened faintly under the dew, the early light tracing where her path always cut through, that same diagonal line she carved each morning without shame, and as he looked at it now, an idea began to form. Not born out of anger but out of precision, out of the quiet mind of an engineer who had spent his life designing systems that never failed. He had tried decency, he had tried reason, and both had been mocked. Now it was time to try something different, something clever, something that would speak louder than words without saying anything at all. He went into the garage, the smell of oil and wood mixing in the air, and laid out a roll of old blueprints across his workbench, not for a building or a bridge this time, but for something far simpler yet far more satisfying. He began sketching his yard, marking the exact path Karen always took, the curve where her dog usually paused, the distance to the fence, the width between the flower beds, every detail mapped with surgical care. He could already see it, an invisible line of defense, one that wouldn't harm, wouldn't destroy, but would make her think twice before stepping there again. By sunrise, he was already at the hardware store, his cart filled with small motion sensors, waterproof speakers disguised as garden ornaments, thin plastic mesh, and several new rolls of turf. To anyone watching, it looked like he was setting up a new irrigation system or upgrading his garden lighting. Nothing suspicious. He greeted the clerk politely, paid in cash, and drove home with the calm focus of a man preparing not for war, but for closure. The neighborhood was quiet as he unloaded the boxes, and even though he noticed a few curious eyes peeking through curtains, he didn't care. They could whisper all they wanted. They had done enough of that already. He changed into work clothes, rolled up his sleeves, and started digging. The sound of his shovel striking earth echoed softly in the morning stillness. He worked methodically, cutting narrow trenches that followed the same path Karen's shoes always pressed into the soil. Every scoop of dirt felt like erasing another insult, another smirk, another condescending laugh from those HOA meetings. He measured twice, set each sensor exactly where her foot would land, buried them under the soil, then laid the mesh over the top so that even the sharpest eye couldn't see it. He routed the wiring discreetly along the garden edge to the small shed near the back fence, where he installed the power hub and control box. It was delicate work, and his steady hands never faltered. As he connected the final wire, a faint beep confirmed the system was alive. The garden lights blinked once, then settled back into silence. He grinned, wiping the sweat from his forehead. By mid-afternoon, the heat rose heavy and thick, but Michael didn't stop. He installed tiny speakers near the hedges, programming them with a calm, robotic voice. He recorded himself. Warning, private property. Step away. The voice was even polite, but unnerving when heard suddenly. He tested the range and adjusted the volume until it was perfect. Loud enough to startle, quiet enough not to wake the whole neighborhood. Then he set the sensors to trigger the moment someone entered the lawn center. Finally, he replaced the dug-up soil with fresh turf, pressing it down gently until the lawn looked untouched, every inch smooth and natural. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, there was no sign that anything had changed. To the naked eye, it was the same peaceful yard as always. But underneath, the ground was no longer just grass. It was a boundary that could finally defend itself. When night came, he stood at the window with a small remote in hand, testing the system one last time. A faint flash of red lit up the garden lights, and the voice echoed softly, "Warning, private property." He couldn't help but smile. It wasn't revenge. It was balance restored. He switched everything off and went to bed early, sleeping better than he had in weeks. The next morning came bright and still, a gentle breeze swaying the branches. Michael poured his coffee, took his usual place by the window, and waited. He didn't have to wait long. At precisely 7:30, the familiar figure appeared. Karen, in her pastel tracksuit, sunglasses glinting, leash in hand, dog trotting ahead. She walked with her usual confidence, cutting across his lawn without hesitation. Michael watched silently, his heart steady but his lips curling in anticipation. As soon as her foot touched the center of the yard, the grass chirped faintly, the hidden sensors activating. A sharp beep cut through the morning air, followed by the robotic voice. Warning, private property. Step away. The words echoed from the bushes, calm but chilling. Karen froze mid-step, her coffee cup trembling, and the dog barked wildly, jerking at the leash. The voice repeated itself. Warning, trespassing detected. Then the garden lights blinked bright red in a perfect circle around her. Her scream could have woken the dead. She dropped her coffee, stumbling backward, eyes wide as if she had stepped on a live wire. What is this? She shrieked, spinning around, trying to find the source of the sound. The dog barked louder, its leash wrapping around her legs as she tripped over the curb. The voice echoed one last time. Private property secured. She scrambled up, face flushed red with humiliation, and ran off the lawn, dragging her dog like a terrified child. Michael didn't move. He just took another sip of coffee, the faintest smile tugging at his mouth. For the first time in months, he felt peace. Not the kind that came from silence, but from justice. Within an hour, the neighborhood was buzzing. Karen had gone door to door, ranting about electric fences and illegal surveillance, her voice carrying all the way down the street. Some neighbors listened politely, others struggled not to laugh. By noon, even the HOA group chat was on fire, full of wild rumors about what Michael had done. He didn't respond to any of it. He spent the afternoon quietly trimming his hedges, whistling to himself, the very image of calm. When the HOA president called him later that day, her tone was a mix of authority and fear. Michael, we've received a complaint from Mrs. Dillard. She says you've installed some sort of system in your yard. He answered evenly, yes, a motion-activated lighting and voice alert system. Perfectly legal. It's in the HOA's own guidelines for security and decoration. There was a pause. Well, some of the neighbors find it disturbing. Only those who trespass, he replied simply. The president sighed, defeated, and muttered, we'll review it, before hanging up. That night, Michael sat on his porch as the sun melted into the horizon, the air cooling around him. He could hear the faint sounds of laughter from a few houses away. Word had spread faster than wildfire. Karen had become the talk of the neighborhood, not for her authority, but for her panic. Someone had even started calling her the Lawn Queen as a joke. He didn't laugh out loud, but the corners of his mouth curved just slightly. It wasn't about payback anymore. It was about reclaiming dignity in a world that had dismissed his voice. For once, he didn't feel like the quiet man at the back of the meeting hall. He felt like someone who had taken control. The following morning, when Karen came out to walk her dog, she stopped at the edge of her driveway and stared at his yard. The memory of yesterday's humiliation was still fresh in her eyes. The grass looked harmless, calm, even inviting. But she didn't step forward. Not a single inch. She tugged her dog the long way around the street, pretending to check her phone, and Michael watched through the blinds with quiet amusement. The system had done more than protect his property. It had rewritten the balance of power. As days passed, neighbors stopped siding with her. Some even came over to ask him about his smart lawn system, pretending curiosity but clearly enjoying the story. Michael never bragged. He just said, "It's amazing what a little creativity can do," and left it at that. But deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't just buried sensors and wires beneath the grass. He'd buried every ounce of mockery, every insult, every sneer they had thrown at him. Now the ground itself spoke for him, and that was far more satisfying than any argument could ever be. Karen didn't learn her lesson right away. Pride never dies easy, and for people like her, embarrassment burns longer than guilt. So when she showed up the next morning, Michael wasn't even surprised. He was sitting quietly at his kitchen table with his coffee steaming beside him, pretending to read the newspaper but watching through the reflection on the window as she stood on the sidewalk, staring at his lawn with suspicion in her eyes, her dog sniffing nervously at the grass like it remembered the day before better than she did. She hesitated for a long time, biting her lip, pretending to check her phone, then finally stepped forward, the leash tight in her hand, and Michael felt a mix of curiosity and quiet satisfaction. She wanted to prove to herself that she wasn't scared, that she still ruled this little corner of the neighborhood. But as soon as her heel touched the center of the yard, the motion sensors whispered to life. The soft mechanical voice echoed again from the hidden speakers. Warning, private property, step away. Calm and clear, and this time the garden lights didn't just flash. They pulsed red like a heartbeat, one after another across the yard, chasing her steps as she froze in terror. She screamed again, spilling her coffee, stumbling backward, her dog barking hysterically as she tripped over her own feet. And from the corner of his eye, Michael could see two neighbors peeking out through their curtains, watching, trying not to laugh. And he didn't move, didn't speak. He just sipped his coffee slowly, the taste of quiet victory warming his throat. By noon, the incident was already all over the neighborhood chat. Someone had filmed it from their window, uploading it with the caption, "Karen versus the talking lawn." And within an hour it had dozens of laughing emojis and comments, people pretending they were concerned but clearly enjoying every second. And Michael saw it only briefly before closing the app and turning back to his workbench. He didn't need to celebrate. He had already done what he set out to do. Peace wasn't just silence. It was control, and for the first time since she moved in, he had both. But peace in places ruled by people like Karen never lasts. That evening, as the sun sank low and the shadows stretched long across the street, Michael heard the crunch of tires on gravel and looked up to see a black SUV pulling into Karen's driveway. Out stepped Denise, the same smug HOA vice president from the meeting, the one who had laughed at him when he tried to explain his problem weeks ago. And now she was back, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a thin line, wearing that same practiced expression of authority that only people with no real power seem to have. Karen was already outside waiting for her, talking loudly, waving her arms as if giving a witness statement, and within minutes, both women were marching toward his house like they were heading to court. Michael met them at the fence, calm, hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. Denise spoke first. "Mr. Turner, we've received several complaints regarding your installation," she said, glancing at the grass like it might jump at her. "It's creating distress in the neighborhood and could be a violation of the Community Harmony Code." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Distress?" he asked. "It's a motion light and speaker system, no different than the ones people use for raccoons." Karen cut in, her voice sharp and trembling. "It screamed at me. It scared my dog. This is harassment." Michael almost smiled. "It didn't scream. It gave a polite warning," he said evenly. "And it only activates when someone steps onto my property, which, according to these documents, includes the area you keep walking across." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded paper and handed it over. A copy of his property survey stamped by the county office, the lines clearly marked. Denise looked at it, her eyes narrowing slightly, then at Karen, whose face went pale. "That can't be right," Karen stammered. "That's the path we've always used. Tradition doesn't overwrite law," Michael said softly. "You and your friends should know that. You run the HOA. Denise shifted uncomfortably, flipping through her clipboard, looking for any rule she could twist. But there was nothing, and she knew it. Still she tried to sound firm. "Well, even if that's the case, the HOA requests you remove the system immediately. It's unnecessary and disruptive." Michael looked at her with calm eyes and said, "Unnecessary? So is trespassing. Yet here we are." The silence that followed was thick, the kind of silence that weighs on pride and eats at arrogance. Karen's mouth opened, then closed again, and Michael could see the fury in her eyes, not because she was right, but because she had lost control. He didn't gloat, he didn't shout, he just smiled politely. "If the HOA files a formal complaint, I'll be happy to respond in writing with documentation," he said, his tone final, and then he turned and walked back into his house, leaving them standing at the fence like two schoolteachers who had just been dismissed by the student they came to scold. That night, the street was quiet, unusually quiet. Even the children playing outside kept their distance from his lawn. Everyone had seen or heard enough to know better. but Karen's house glowed late into the night, the lights flickering behind drawn curtains as she paced inside, plotting, frustrated, whispering through phone calls, her ego unable to let the matter rest. Michael sat by his window, the soft hum of his porch light filling the silence, watching as the hours slipped by, and he knew this wasn't over. People like Karen never let things end when they're wrong. They dig deeper until they bury themselves completely. The next morning came with clouds heavy and gray, a low hum of thunder rolling in the distance, and as Michael stepped out to collect his mail, he saw Karen again, standing on her porch with folded arms, glaring at him like he'd stolen something from her, and beside her was another man. A tall one in a suit, maybe a lawyer or some HOA enforcer she'd managed to drag in. They walked over, uninvited as usual, stopping just short of the invisible line where the grass began. The man cleared his throat. "Mr. Turner, I'm here on behalf of the Homeowners Association. We need to resolve this trespassing situation peacefully." Michael chuckled softly. Funny choice of words, considering I'm the only one not trespassing. The man frowned, flipping through a small folder. "The HOA board believes your system is aggressive and intimidating." Michael tilted his head. "So, is being walked on every day? Yet that wasn't a concern," Karen snapped. "Don't play smart with us, Michael. You're making this neighborhood miserable." He stepped closer, just enough for his presence to make her step back, and said, "No, Karen, I made it quiet." The man tried to regain control, talking about bylaws, neighbor relations, and community harmony again, but Michael was done playing their game. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. "Everything you're saying right now is being recorded, and before you start lecturing me about rules, you should know that the county inspector already cleared my installation as legal." The man froze mid-sentence, glancing at Karen, whose confidence was crumbling fast, and Michael continued, "Now, unless the HOA wants to get involved in private property disputes, I suggest you stop harassing me before I take this to the county office." His voice was still calm, but there was steel underneath, the kind of quiet authority that didn't come from anger, but from certainty. The man nodded slowly, muttered something about reviewing the situation, and walked away quickly, leaving Karen standing there, red-faced, seething, her dog barking nervously at the tension. She stared at Michael, hate glowing behind her smile, and said through clenched teeth, "You'll regret this." And Michael smiled, stepping closer. "Maybe, but not today." By the time the rain started, Karen's threats had faded into silence, and Michael sat on his porch watching the drops fall onto the grass. The same grass that once brought him frustration but now made him proud. Each drop sliding down the blades like a quiet promise that no one would cross this boundary again. The thunder rolled overhead, and for the first time, he didn't feel alone in the fight. His yard had become something more than soil and plants. It had become a statement, a living wall of quiet resistance against arrogance. Inside, his phone buzzed with messages from curious neighbors, some supportive, others cautious, but all of them talking about him. And for a man who once blended into the background, he had suddenly become the story everyone wanted to hear. And yet he said nothing, because the louder they talked, the more his silence spoke. That night, as the rain stopped and the air cooled, Michael looked out one last time before going to bed, the moonlight reflecting softly off the wet grass, and he whispered, "Let her come again just once more." Not as a challenge but as a test, and he smiled, knowing that the next time Karen stepped onto his property, she wouldn't just face a talking lawn. She'd face her own pride collapsing under the weight of reality, and that, he thought, was the best kind of justice there was. The next morning arrived heavy with humidity, clouds hanging low like unspoken threats, and Michael knew before he even poured his coffee that something was coming. Because people like Karen never stayed quiet for long. They didn't accept defeat. They circled it until they found a new way to twist the knife. He stood at the window as the familiar rumble of SUVs filled the street. 3 of them this time, glossy black with tinted windows, pulling up like an uninvited parade of authority. And from the first one stepped the HOA president, Denise's superior, a man named Caldwell, the kind who wore pressed suits and fake smiles that always came with warnings hidden underneath. Behind him came Denise herself, clutching a clipboard as if it were a weapon, and Karen, of course, trailing behind them like a victorious general who thought this would be her moment of glory. They marched down the sidewalk, their polished shoes clicking in rhythm, and stopped at the edge of his property, the man calling out, "Mr. Turner, we need to talk about your lawn." Michael opened the door, calm as ever, the scent of coffee still clinging to his hands, and said, "You're standing on the sidewalk. That's a good start." Caldwell forced a tight smile. "We've received multiple complaints regarding your recent installation. It's creating tension in the neighborhood and violating community harmony." Michael leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. "Tension? You mean people stopped walking across land they don't own?" Denise cut in sharply. "Michael, this isn't a joke. The HOA has authority to enforce compliance with all neighborhood regulations." He folded his arms. "Then maybe the HOA should start by enforcing trespassing laws instead of ignoring them." Karen scoffed loudly. "You can't own a path everyone's used for years." Michael's gaze locked on her, steady and cold. "I can if the land's mine, and it is, every inch of it." He held up the county deed he had printed again, the official seal catching the morning light. Caldwell hesitated, the flicker of doubt flashing across his face as he recognized the authenticity of the document. "Be that as it may," he said, shifting tone. "The HOA has determined that your system is hostile in nature. It's frightening residents." Michael smiled slightly, the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Only the ones trespassing, I assume?" No one answered. The silence stretched long and uncomfortable until Karen finally burst out. "You're ruining the neighborhood. Everyone's talking about you. They think you're crazy." He took a slow step forward, his voice dropping low. "Good. Maybe that means they'll finally leave me alone." Denise opened her mouth to speak again, but he wasn't finished. "I came to you all before, politely, with proof, with requests for help. You laughed at me, said it was just grass. Now that I've protected it, suddenly it's a crisis." Caldwell shifted uncomfortably, pretending to glance at his clipboard to avoid Michael's eyes. "Mr. Turner, we don't want this to escalate. The HOA can fine you for noncompliance." Michael chuckled softly. "Try it. I'll just send it to the county inspector and have them review every unapproved structure in this subdivision. Let's see how many of your friends survive that inspection." For the first time, Caldwell lost his polished composure, the mask cracking just enough to reveal uncertainty underneath. Denise looked down, pretending to write something, while Karen's lips tightened into a line so thin it was almost invisible. Michael turned, opened his gate, and gestured politely. "If you'd like to discuss this further, please step onto the lawn." Caldwell blinked. "Excuse me." Michael tilted his head. "Go on. You said there's nothing wrong with people crossing my property. Let's talk about it from there." None of them moved. He smiled faintly. "That's what I thought," and walked back up his porch steps, leaving them standing in awkward silence. After a long pause, Caldwell muttered something about consulting legal, then turned sharply and walked away. Denise followed quickly, and Karen stood there a moment longer, staring at him with that same hateful glare, until finally she hissed, "This isn't over," before storming off. Michael watched them go, sipping his coffee, the soft hum of satisfaction rising in his chest. By afternoon, word had spread again. The neighborhood was alive with gossip, curtains fluttering as faces peeked out, phones buzzing with whispers of HOA showdown, and Karen lost again. But Michael didn't care. He sat on his porch swing, fixing a loose hinge, the smell of cut grass thick in the air. Every once in a while, someone passing by would nod politely or give him a half-smile, the kind that said they admired him but were too scared to say it aloud. For years, he'd been invisible here, just another quiet man who kept his head down. But now his name carried weight. People had learned not to mess with the man whose lawn talked back. Then, around sunset, a knock came at his door. It wasn't Karen this time. It was his neighbor, Tom, a man who'd never said more than hello in passing. Tom looked nervous, scratching his neck. "Hey, Mike, just wanted to say, what you did with the lawn, that's genius, man. Everyone's been wanting to stand up to her for years. Just didn't think anyone had the guts." Michael smiled modestly. "It's just a little technology and a lot of patience." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "Still, you made a point none of us could. They chatted for a while. Small talk about yards and weather. But underneath, Michael could sense the shift. Respect replacing pity, quiet acknowledgement replacing judgment. For the first time, he felt like part of the neighborhood, not its outsider. But that feeling didn't last long, because Karen wasn't done. That night, around 11, Michael's motion sensor lights blinked faintly. He checked the monitor and saw her on the edge of his property, flashlight in hand, muttering under her breath, maybe trying to prove the system was illegal or looking for a way to disable it. He watched in silence, not angry, just tired of the endlessness of her pride. She took one step onto the grass and the familiar voice echoed again. Warning, private property. Step away. Her flashlight trembled, and for a second, he thought she might run. But she stood frozen, whispering something he couldn't hear. Then the sprinklers activated. He had connected them earlier that week, timed with the sensors for a softer deterrent. A perfect spray of cold water hit her squarely in the chest, soaking her completely. She screamed, stumbling backward, slipping on the wet pavement, and falling hard onto her driveway, the flashlight clattering away. Michael watched quietly as she got up, drenched and furious, shaking her fist toward his house before storming back inside. The sprinklers shut off automatically, the system resetting, the lawn returning to silence, glistening under the moonlight like nothing had happened at all. The next morning, he woke to find a printed notice taped to his mailbox, a bright red HOA violation warning, unauthorized security installation, removal required. He smiled, peeled it off, and placed it neatly in a drawer with the others, every single complaint he'd collected since this started. A growing pile of failed intimidation. That afternoon, he drove to the county zoning office and filed an official harassment complaint against the HOA for attempting to interfere with private property maintenance. When he returned home, he passed Karen in her driveway, holding another stack of papers in her hand, glaring at him with weary eyes. "You think you can win against everyone?" she called out. He paused, looking straight at her. "No," he said simply. "I don't need to. I just need to win against you." She didn't reply. For once, her mouth stayed shut. The days that followed were quieter. The HOA went silent, waiting for the county's response, and no one walked through his yard anymore. Even the mailman used the sidewalk. Karen avoided him completely, her arrogance replaced by cautious distance. The lawn grew greener than it ever had before, as if even the earth itself was grateful for the peace. Sometimes Michael would sit outside in the evenings, the golden light fading across his garden, and he'd think about how small things, simple things like grass, patience, and a bit of cleverness, could expose the arrogance of people who thought they owned everything they saw. The war wasn't over, maybe it never would be, but for now, his home was his again, and that was enough. He leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of months lift off his shoulders, and whispered to himself with a quiet smile. "It's over when I say it's over, not when they do." Weeks passed and the neighborhood had fallen into a strange new calm, the kind that always follows a storm but still smells faintly of thunder, and Michael could feel it every morning when he stepped out with his coffee, the air lighter, the silence deeper, as if the entire street was holding its breath waiting to see what he would do next. Yet he did nothing. He didn't boast or gloat. He just went about his days quietly, mowing his lawn, trimming his hedges, and enjoying the simple pleasure of watching Karen's car drive by without stopping, her eyes always darting toward his property but her feet never daring to cross it again. Even her little dog seemed to have learned its lesson, tugging her the long way around the block instead of toward his grass. And for Michael, that was victory enough, not through confrontation or shouting matches, but through patience and persistence, the same tools he had always used to fix things in his life. The HOA stopped sending letters too. Maybe because the county's warning had finally reached them, or maybe because they'd grown tired of losing every time they tried. But whatever the reason, Michael's mailbox stayed empty of threats for the first time in months, and that silence felt like music. But the real surprise came a few days later when Denise herself walked up to his fence, clipboard gone, her usual sharpness dulled into something that almost resembled humility. She stood there for a moment, shifting awkwardly before saying, "Mr. Turner, the board wanted me to let you know that we're dropping all pending complaints, and we'd appreciate it if you attended the next meeting." Her voice cracked slightly, as if the words themselves were heavy. Michael looked up from his garden hose, surprised but not showing it. "You want me at the meeting?" he asked, and she nodded. "Yes, the president thinks maybe we overreacted, and it might help if we, clear things up publicly." He smiled faintly. "So now I'm the guest of honor?" Denise sighed. "Something like that." He didn't answer immediately, just turned off the hose, wiped his hands on his jeans and said, "All right, I'll come, but only if I can speak freely." She hesitated, then nodded and walked away, and as she did, he noticed something in her step. Something that looked like respect, or at least the start of it. That evening, as the sun bled orange across the sky, Michael sat on his porch thinking about how far things had come, how a few weeks ago he was the quiet neighbor being mocked in meetings, and now the same people wanted him back in that room, not as a joke, but as a voice they couldn't ignore. He thought about all the nights he doubted himself, all the times he wondered if fighting back was even worth it, and he realized that what mattered wasn't the lawn or the censors or the endless arguments. It was the principle, the line that said, "This is mine and you don't get to take it." And that line was something no HOA could ever erase. When the day of the meeting came, he walked in just as calm as before, the same hall, the same cheap coffee smell. But the energy was different now. People turned their heads when he entered, some smiling nervously, others pretending to look busy with their papers. Karen sat near the back this time, her sunglasses gone, her face quiet, and for once she didn't meet his eyes, maybe because deep down she already knew what he'd come to say. Denise motioned for him to speak and the room hushed. Michael cleared his throat, placed a folded paper on the table and said, "I'm not here to argue. I just want to remind everyone that respect is a two-way street. It doesn't matter how small an issue seems. When someone tells you their boundary is being crossed, you listen, because if you don't, eventually they'll make sure you do." His voice was steady, calm, not angry, just certain, the kind of tone that carried truth instead of volume. He didn't need to mention names. Everyone knew who and what he was talking about. He continued, "We all moved here for peace, for a sense of home, not to fight over grass or fences. So maybe the next time someone complains, we stop laughing and start listening. It's cheaper than replacing pride later." The room stayed silent for a long time after that. The kind of silence that comes when people realize they've been part of something ugly without meaning to. Then the president nodded slowly, cleared his throat and said, "Noted, Mr. Turner." And just like that, the tension broke, not with applause or cheers, but with quiet understanding. Michael didn't stay long after that. He didn't need to. He had said what needed saying, and as he walked out, he passed by Karen, who still hadn't looked up. But he didn't hold it against her. He just gave a small nod and kept walking, because some victories don't need witnesses. They just need peace. When he got home that night, the air felt different, lighter somehow. The moon casting silver over the grass that had caused so much trouble, and yet stood now as a symbol of quiet triumph. He walked across it slowly, barefoot, feeling the cool blades against his skin, the hidden sensors beneath it still humming faintly, a reminder of the battle fought and won without violence, only wit and patience. He stopped in the middle, looked up at the stars and smiled to himself, whispering softly, "This was never about the lawn." Because deep down he knew it wasn't. It was about dignity, about drawing a line where arrogance couldn't cross, and as he turned back toward the house, he noticed movement across the street. Karen, standing by her porch, watching him, not glaring, not fuming, just watching quietly, and then, almost shyly, she gave a small nod before turning away, closing her door behind her. That moment, small and fleeting as it was, felt like closure, the kind that doesn't come with apologies but with understanding. And from that day on, the shortcut across his yard became just another patch of grass, untouched, respected, and peaceful. Michael eventually turned the system into something beautiful. He replaced the warning voice with the soft sound of wind chimes and the flashing lights with gentle garden lanterns that glowed at dusk, creating a warm halo of color across the lawn. The same ground that had once been a battlefield now looked like something out of a painting, and neighbors began stopping by again, complimenting the garden, asking for tips, even inviting him to barbecues. He didn't bring up the past. He didn't need to. Every smile, every nod, every small gesture of respect was proof that he had changed something far greater than just a piece of land. He had reminded an entire street what boundaries meant. And sometimes, late at night, When the world was quiet and the stars hung low, Michael would sit on his porch with his coffee and watch the gentle flicker of the lights over his yard, thinking of how far a man could go when pushed, how even the quietest person could make the loudest statement without raising his voice. And he would smile that same calm smile he wore the first morning the system came to life, whispering to himself, "Peace earned is peace kept," before heading inside the lawn, behind him glowing softly like a sleeping guardian, its lesson forever buried beneath the grass where Karen would never step again. Months slipped by like pages in a quiet book, and the small war that once burned across Michael Turner's yard faded into neighborhood legend. A whispered story that everyone knew but no one dared to retell in front of him, because the man who had once been ignored had become a quiet authority, a symbol of how patience could cut deeper than anger, and how silence could win battles that shouting never could. The grass grew thick and green, perfectly trimmed, no footprints disturbing its soft waves anymore, and Michael treated it with the same care he gave his morning coffee, calm and deliberate. The air around his home seemed cleaner now, lighter, as if the ground itself had exhaled after months of tension. He didn't need the sensors anymore. He barely kept them on, but he never removed them either. They were part of the land now, silent guardians beneath the soil, reminders of a time when respect had to be earned the hard way. The HOA had gone through changes too. Caldwell stepped down not long after. Denise became a quieter, humbler version of herself, and new members joined the board, ones who actually spoke to the residents before deciding things for them. It was strange, seeing people who once avoided eye contact now wave to him first, smile genuinely, even stop to ask for advice on home repairs. It wasn't power that he had gained, it was something rarer, acknowledgement. One afternoon, he was sitting on his porch sanding a piece of wood for a new birdhouse when Tom from next door walked over with 2 cold beers and said, "You know, you kind of changed this whole place." Michael looked up, half smiling. "How's that?" Tom sat on the steps beside him, opening the bottles. "Well, people used to think the HOA ran the neighborhood. Now they remember that the neighborhood runs itself. No one messes with anyone anymore. You did that without yelling once." Michael chuckled softly. "Guess I just got tired of being quiet in the wrong way." Tom nodded, raising his bottle. "To that, my friend." They clinked the glass and sat in comfortable silence, the hum of cicadas blending with the sound of wind through the trees. It was peace, not the kind that was perfect or grand, but the kind that grows slowly after a long season of storms. That evening, Michael decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, something he hadn't done in months without feeling watched. The streets glowed under the setting sun. The same sidewalks that once carried gossip now carried laughter and easy conversation. Kids rode their bikes, sprinklers misted the air, and somewhere down the block, he could hear a barbecue starting up. As he walked, people waved, and a few even called out, "Evening, Mike," like they'd known him for years. He waved back, and for the first time it didn't feel like politeness. It felt like belonging. When he passed Karen's house, he slowed down slightly. The place looked different now. The sharp edges softened, new flowers planted along the walkway, and on the porch sat Karen herself. No sunglasses this time, no sneer, just a tired woman petting her small dog while staring off into the distance. When she saw him, her shoulders stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed, and she gave a small nod. It wasn't an apology, but it was something, and Michael nodded back. A silent peace offering that didn't need words. She looked down, perhaps realizing that the war she started had ended long ago, and she had lost not to force but to her own pride. He kept walking, passing houses that had once felt like foreign territory, and as the sky deepened into twilight, he found himself back at his fence, the yard glowing gently under the warm lanterns he'd added in place of the old red sensors, soft golden light spilling across the grass like a quiet promise. He sat on the porch again, listening to the hum of the neighborhood settling into the night, and for a moment, he thought about how it all began, with a cup of coffee, a careless woman, and a patch of grass that wasn't just land but the symbol of something bigger. It was never about revenge, not really. It was about drawing a line where respect had worn thin and standing firm until people remembered what it meant. He smiled at the thought, the kind of smile that comes from deep satisfaction, the kind that doesn't need witnesses or applause. A week later, at the next community event, He was sitting under a canopy when Denise approached him again, this time with a paper in her hand and a smile that didn't look forced. "Michael," she said, "we'd like to name next month's volunteer cleanup after you. Turner Day. You've taught this place something important, and we figured we should recognize it properly." He blinked, caught off guard, then laughed quietly, shaking his head. "I didn't do anything special. I just asked people to stay off my lawn." Denise laughed too. "Yeah, but in doing that you reminded everyone where their own lines are." He nodded, humbly accepting the paper she handed him, though deep down, he didn't care for honors. He cared for the peace that now hummed through every inch of his street. Later that night, the stars came out clearer than usual, and Michael found himself standing barefoot on the cool grass again, feeling the soft blades between his toes. The house lights glowed behind him, the crickets sang their endless song, and a faint breeze brushed past carrying the scent of pine and rain. He thought about the people who had laughed at him, the arguments, the meetings, the insults, and how little all of that mattered now, because in the end, he didn't win by fighting them. He won by outlasting them, by staying calm while they burned themselves out on their own arrogance. The ground beneath his feet felt alive, steady, and he whispered softly to himself, "Peace isn't given, it's built." He turned to go inside, but before he did, he looked once more toward Karen's house. Her lights were off now, her curtains drawn, her world quiet. Maybe she finally understood, maybe not, but that wasn't his concern anymore. The lesson was buried deep enough in the soil for her to find it every time she looked at the grass she no longer crossed. He smiled, closed his door, and the night settled over the neighborhood like a soft blanket. In the end, Michael didn't just get his yard back. He got his life back, and he left a mark on every person around him without raising his voice or lifting a hand. And under the gentle hum of the earth, the sensors still slept quietly beneath the soil, not as weapons, but as watchful sentinels of respect, waiting patiently in case someone ever forgot the story of the man whose lawn spoke louder than the whole HOA combined.